it's definitely political. It's still being, run from politics from above, and I'm hoping more and more Canadians open their eyes to what's going on right now across this country, because it's sickening.
This is a truly political trial that is un-Canadian. That's a quote from Marilyn Burns, the defense attorney representing Anthony Olenek. She said that in her opening statement during today's proceedings in the trial of her client and Chris Carbert here in Lethbridge, Alberta. Robert Kraychik reporting for Rebel News. Both Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek are charged with conspiracy to murder. The Crown is accusing the two men of conspiring to murder police officers during their time protesting at the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade. The two defendants are also accused of unlawful possession of a firearm for a dangerous purpose, of mischief over $5,000. Anthony Olenek is additionally charged with unlawful possession of an explosive device for a dangerous purpose. The two men have pled not guilty to all charges against them. Now, in case you don't recall, the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade was this peaceful and civilly disobedient protest, much like the Freedom Convoy that took place in Ottawa around the same time, with both demonstrations broadly opposed to what I refer to as the COVID-19 enterprise. This apparatus of surveillance, control, and coercion, mandates, edicts, orders, all marketed as this public health measure to reduce COVID-19 transmission. Marilyn Burns critiqued the conduct of the RCMP during her opening statement today following the conclusion of the Crown's presentation of evidence and the closing of the Crown's case. I'll share some quotes with you. Marilyn Burns told jurors that they would be, quote, at the very least, disappointed with how Canada's own RCMP conducted themselves before and after the process. She also told the jurors that they would be alarmed about the, quote, conduct of Alberta's provincial government and Canada's federal government, given how they are, quote, entwined with the RCMP. So I'm here with Chris Barber. You folks will be familiar with him. Now, Chris, you came in towards the end of proceedings. What did you think about the opening statement from Marilyn Burns, Anthony Olenek's attorney?
Very powerful, actually. I really, really like the fact that she went for the political aspect of this whole trial, which is the same thing in other trials.
Earlier in this trial, the Crown invited 3 female RCMP undercover operators, UCOs, to testify. These 3 female UCOs had been sent to Coutts to ostensibly investigate the protest and blockade of 2022. Marilyn Burns addressed this during her opening statement. She said this about her client, Anthony Olenek, that a pretty little woman caught his eye. She also said that her client, quote, looked for love in the wrong place. So Marilyn Burns is alluding to an aspect of sexuality that had been at play in the context of statements attributed to her client by these female UCOs in their testimonies. Marilyn Burns also addressed her client's politics. She said that Anthony Olenek had this expectation of ongoing decline across the country in the following terms, quote, economically, socially, and politically. She said her client engaged in behavior that is, quote, commonly known as prepping. In other words, Anthony Olenek is a prepper because he has this anticipation, this expectation of terrible things coming down the pike given the status quo of contemporary politics. It's also important to remember that the judge overseeing this trial, Justice David Labrenz, had specifically directed jurors earlier in the trial not to make any inferences of guilt with respect to the charges against the defendants based on their interpretations of the ideologies or political persuasions of the defendants. In other words, jurors must not make inferences of guilt based on the political ideologies of the defendants before them. And now, what about the testimony that you heard from this witness? It was Corey Toon. You were obviously all over the place when it came to the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. Was there any sort of commonality that you noticed between the way he was describing what he observed at the Coutts protest and, let's say, the atmosphere, the vibe, the even logistical realities of Ottawa?
Yeah, the police buildup. The police buildup and the tactics that law enforcement used, I guess, pressured by the government against peaceful protesters. We were there peacefully, and we had the right to be there peacefully. And the buildup of the law enforcement, in fact, the pressure from law enforcement to escalate something was evident.
The judge basically told jurors that the politics of the defendants, their ideologies, are not on trial. The final piece of evidence presented by the Crown for the jurors today was this series of phone conversations involving the defendants. So keep in mind that the RCMP surveilled these defendants, among many others, listened to and recorded their telephone conversations. Some of those conversations, again, were played today as evidence. Some of these conversations were between Anthony Olenek and his mother, Chris Carbert and an unknown male. Now, I can't relay these conversations to you folks in this context because it was too difficult to follow as a journalist in the courtroom. There are too many details to capture. Also, it's just much better if you hear those conversations for yourselves, which is why tomorrow I'm going to submit this, let's call it, evidentiary release request form, which needs to get approved by the judge, which I'm sure will be the case. And that way, in a future video, I can integrate them and you can hear them for yourselves and see for yourselves, determine for yourselves whether or not you think there's anything important or incriminating or exculpatory within those talks. More broadly, why are you here today? Why did you come in and take some time out to observe proceedings?
We got 2 Canadians right now that have been in custody in a remand center for 800 and some days. That's a Canadian travesty in itself right there. A lot of the evidence that they've portrayed against these guys has been fictional. I don't think they've even came close to hit the mark for a guilty verdict, just from what I've heard of what's been portrayed so far. This is Canada. This is what we're living in right now in this country. It's a political nightmare, and our justice system is broken as well as our parliament system. So I'm here to support Tony and Chris. Okay, I want to get back to the first question. I actually want more meat on this bone. You mentioned the political commentary from Marilyn Burns, that this was a political prosecution. Can you flesh that out? What does it mean for the prosecution to be political? Well, it does, because this whole case centers on the Emergencies Act being invoked by the Prime Minister Trudeau to justify him beating innocent protesters on Wellington and in Coutts. Well, Coutts was cleaned up by the time we were beaten in Ottawa, so it's definitely political. It's still being run from politics from above, and I'm hoping more and more Canadians open their eyes to what's going on right now across this country, because it's sickening.
This journalistic project, reporting on this trial, is a lot of work. It's not just being in the courtroom, it's all the sort of stuff that happens outside the courtroom. And in case you folks don't know, I don't work for free. So we've got operational costs at Rebel News, and we depend on our dear and generous audience to keep this enterprise going, because, as you know, we don't get handouts like the so-called mainstream media from the federal government to toe that company line. So please chip in, contribute, help us keep this going. Go to truckertrial.com, donate, and stay up to date with our ongoing coverage.